Story 1. The Descent. With their flashlights barely piercing the suffocating darkness, Emma and Sarah took a steadying breath and opened the trapdoor once more. The descent felt longer this time, as if the stairs themselves were stretching to draw them deeper into the unknown. The chill hit them instantly, a biting cold that clung to their skin like fog. The air was thick, heavy with a musty scent that made them instinctively cover their noses. "Tom?" Sarah called out, her voice sounding small, swallowed by the shadows surrounding them. The only answer was the echo of her voice, bouncing back eerily in the silence. As they reached the bottom of the staircase, their flashlights illuminated the basement. It was far larger than they'd anticipated, a labyrinthine room, cluttered with strange, forgotten objects. Bones, some animal and some unrecognizable, were scattered across shelves and the floor, their white gleam dull under the layers of dust. Glass jars, filled with murky liquids and dark floating shapes, lined one of the walls, and beside them, an old dress hung limply from a nail, stained with dark patches that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Sarah shuddered, clutching Emma's arm. What is all this?" Emma shook her head, her eyes scanning the room in horrified fascination. The basement was like a twisted museum, each object carrying a story they were certain they didn't want to hear. Yet they couldn't look away. Then, breaking the silence, a soft, almost pleading voice drifted from somewhere in the dark. "Help me." It was unmistakably Tom's voice, weak and trembling. It sounded as though it was coming from deeper within the basement, echoing off the walls in a haunting, disembodied way. "Tom!" Emma shouted, stepping forward as Sarah hesitated. "Where are you?" But her question faded into the heavy silence. Emma took a tentative step forward, her flashlight casting an eerie glow over the strange artifacts as she ventured further into the room. Sarah reluctantly followed, her every nerve on edge, as though expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. Part 2, Deeper into Darkness. With each step they took, the basement seemed to grow colder, the dampness seeping through their shoes, chilling them to the bone. The walls, now slick with moisture, bore strange marks, unfamiliar symbols scratched into the stone in frantic, looping patterns. Emma couldn't help but run her fingers over one of the symbols, the grooves rough beneath her skin. There was something deeply unsettling about the symbols, as if they were carved out of desperation or perhaps to ward off something unspeakable. Ahead, Tom's voice called out again, this time louder and more insistent. "Please, help." Emma's heart raced as she pushed forward, her flashlight sweeping the walls and floor. Finally, they reached the far end of the basement, a narrower passage that seemed to lead even deeper underground. The air here was dense with a sour, metallic scent that made their stomachs churn. "Do you think he's down there?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. Emma swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "We don't have a choice. We have to find him." They stepped into the passage, their flashlights flickering slightly, as though reluctant to illuminate what lay ahead. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and shifting in ways that made Emma's skin prickle with unease. It felt like the darkness itself was alive, pressing in on them, waiting. Part 3, The Hall of Shadows. The passageway opened into a second room, even colder and darker than the first. Here, the floor was covered in a thin layer of water that rippled as they walked, the sound echoing eerily in the confined space. Their lights fell upon more strange objects, a tarnished locket, a bundle of what looked like human hair tied with a red ribbon, and scraps of paper covered in smeared handwriting. Some of the words were legible, messages of terror and pleas for help that sent chills down their spines. Do you think someone else was trapped here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Emma didn't answer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding on something ancient and malevolent. And whatever it was didn't want them there. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Both women froze, their breaths catching in their throats as the shadow took form. It was Tom, or at least, something that looked like him, standing in the corner, his back turned to them. "Tom!" Emma cried, relief flooding through her. She took a step toward him, but Sarah held her back, her grip tight. Something's wrong, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom's figure stood unnaturally still, his shoulders rigid, his head tilted at an odd angle. The longer they looked, the more they realized there was something off about him, the way his body seemed to blend into the darkness, as though he were part of it. Then, slowly, he turned to face them, and Emma's breath hitched. His face was pale, his eyes vacant and glassy, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin that didn't reach his eyes. He looked at them, but there was no recognition, no warmth, only a cold, empty stare. "Help me," he whispered, his voice hollow, echoing in the damp air. Emma felt a chill race down her spine. This wasn't Tom. It was something wearing his face, something that had taken his voice and twisted it into something unrecognizable. Part 4, The Unseen Force. They took a step back, fear taking hold as they realized they had ventured too far. But before they could retreat, Tom's figure lunged forward, moving with a speed and fluidity that didn't seem human. His expression twisted into something dark and malevolent, his eyes now burning with an unnatural light. "Help me," he whispered again, but his voice had changed, deeper and filled with a malicious hunger. Emma stumbled back, grabbing Sarah's hand and dragging her toward the exit. The figure followed them, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were being pulled by strings. "Run!" Emma shouted, her voice filled with panic. They bolted back through the narrow passage, the sound of wet footsteps echoing behind them, getting closer and closer. The objects they'd seen before, the dress, the bones, the symbols, seemed to close in on them, as though the basement itself were trying to trap them. As they reached the stairs, Emma threw herself up the steps, pulling Sarah with her. They burst through the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind them. But the banging continued, heavy and insistent, as though something was trying to break free from below. Part 5, The Final Revelation. They backed away from the trapdoor, breathless and terrified. The pounding eventually stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. They could still hear the faint whispers, echoing up from the basement, taunting them. "Help me!" Emma looked around the cabin, her heart racing. The strange symbols, the blood-stained dress, and Tom's twisted figure, none of it made sense. But she knew one thing: they had to get out of there. Together, Emma and Sarah fled the cabin, leaving behind the echoes of the whispers and the shadows that lurked within. As they reached the edge of the woods, they glanced back one last time. In the window, they saw a faint silhouette watching them, a figure with Tom's face, its empty eyes filled with darkness. The cabin stood silent, waiting, as though it knew they would never truly escape. And deep in the shadows, the whispers continued, calling out to anyone foolish enough to enter its cursed depths. "Help me, more lives!" With that, Emma and Sarah vanished into the mist, leaving behind the cabin and its dark secrets, forever haunted by the memory of their friend, and the terrible realization that some things are better left undisturbed. Story 2. The Truth Uncovered. The cabin was silent, save for the faint rustling of pages as Emma leafed through the worn, dusty journal she had discovered in a drawer. The brittle, yellowed pages seemed barely able to hold together, but something about the journal called to her, as if it held the answers to everything she and her friends had endured. The journal had been tucked away in the darkest corner of the cabin, as if hidden in shame or perhaps to keep something sinister locked within its pages. Her flashlight cast an eerie glow over the handwritten notes and faded ink, each entry laced with desperation and fear. The writing was erratic, the letters growing more jagged and frantic as the entries progressed. From what Emma could gather, the journal belonged to the man in the photograph, the father of the family who had lived there. His entries chronicled a haunting descent into madness, his words haunted by something dark and relentless. The first entries were innocuous enough, full of hopeful notes about moving to the cabin, embracing a quiet life in the woods with his wife and 2 children. But soon, the tone changed. His words grew darker, describing strange visions, voices echoing through the cabin, and the presence of unseen figures lurking in the shadows. The haunting begins. It started with small things, he wrote in one entry. The feeling of being watched, of something moving in the dark corners. We dismissed it as our minds playing tricks on us. But then, we all started hearing the voices. Emma shivered as she read on, feeling the words resonate with her own experiences in the cabin. The journal entries grew increasingly unsettling, recounting how each family member began to experience their own version of the terror. The father described his son waking up with scratch marks on his arms, his daughter screaming in the middle of the night, and his wife insisting that someone was whispering to her as she tried to sleep. The cabin's influence grew stronger, and the father's entries became more urgent, his words hinting at something even darker. A descent into madness. It's like the cabin is alive, he scrawled in one of the later entries. A presence lurks within these walls, feeding on us, growing stronger. It calls to the children, whispers to them when they're alone, draws them to the basement. Emma's stomach churned, her mind flashing to Tom's vacant expression and the sinister way he had whispered for help. Was he too under the cabin's spell, just like the children had been? The father's entries described the children wandering toward the basement at night, drawn to the cold, damp darkness as if they were sleepwalking. The final entries were rushed, written in shaky, smeared handwriting that seemed to quiver with terror. The cabin's hold. Emma's breath caught as she reached the last entry. The ink was smeared, as though written in a hurry, with words scratched out and rewritten in a panic. "The cabin won't let us leave," it read. "We tried, so many times. But every time, it's as if we're drawn back, pulled by an invisible force that tightens its grip. The children, they are not themselves. They wander in the dark, staring at me with hollow eyes, whispering in voices that are no longer theirs." A chill ran down Emma's spine as she read the last lines, written in bold, jagged letters that seemed almost carved into the page. "The children, they are trapped. They cannot leave. We cannot leave. The cabin, it wants us." Her hands shook as she closed the journal, the final words echoing in her mind. The family hadn't just lived in the cabin, they were bound to it, trapped in a never-ending nightmare where their spirits wandered, unable to move on. The cabin had claimed them, just as it was now claiming her friends. A terrifying realization. Emma looked up, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the cabin as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She wasn't just dealing with a haunted cabin, she was in the grip of something far more powerful, a presence that hungered for the living. It had devoured the family before them, twisted their spirits, and now it had her friends. She couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for someone to come along and feed its darkness once again. But even as her instincts told her to run, Emma knew that leaving would be impossible unless she could break the cabin's hold. Her friends were trapped, and so was she. She had to find a way to sever the dark connection that held them all captive. Just as she was closing the journal, a faint whisper drifted through the room, unmistakably familiar. "Emma." It was Tom's voice again, but there was something off about it, something that made her blood run cold. His voice echoed in the cabin, repeating her name over and over, each time weaker, more distorted, as if he were slipping further away. "No," she thought, gripping the journal tightly. "I won't let the cabin take him." Determined, she rose to her feet and steeled herself for what was to come. Story 3. The threat becomes real. Emma and Sarah raced up the stairs, their breath coming in frantic gasps as they threw themselves into the living room. The dim light cast eerie shadows over the cabin's old furniture, which seemed even more sinister than before. They clutched each other, their hearts pounding in unison, desperate for the comfort of the main room, hoping they had left the horrors of the basement behind. But as they caught their breath, Emma's eyes landed on something new, a piece of paper lying on the old wooden table in the center of the room. Her stomach dropped. The paper hadn't been there before, she was certain of it. "Sarah," Emma whispered, pointing at the note. Her voice was a strained mixture of fear and disbelief. Sarah's gaze followed Emma's trembling finger, her eyes widening as she read the words scrawled in a hurried, almost violent handwriting, "You'll never leave." The ink seemed fresh, smeared as though the writer had pressed down too hard. The words radiated a malevolent energy, each letter jagged and erratic, as if carved into the paper by some unseen hand. What is this?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her body frozen in terror. Before Emma could respond, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the cabin, shaking the walls and rattling the few remaining glass windows. They spun around to see the door, now firmly closed, as if it had never been open in the first place. Emma took a cautious step toward it, heart racing as she reached for the handle, her fingers brushing the cold metal. She yanked, but the door wouldn't budge. She tried again, harder, but it remained locked, immovable. "Emma, please tell me this isn't happening," Sarah whimpered, her eyes darting around the room. As Emma struggled with the door, a familiar, sickening scent began to fill the air, the same metallic tang they had noticed on their first night in the cabin. The smell of iron. The smell of blood. The scent was stronger now, thick and pervasive, coating the room like a dark fog. It clung to their throats, making it hard to breathe. Emma's hand dropped from the doorknob as she realized that the cabin's dark influence was no longer subtle. It was suffocating, pressing in on them from every direction. And then, they heard it. Faint whispers, coming from somewhere within the walls, growing louder and louder, as if the cabin itself were alive, feeding off their fear. "Never leave," the voices murmured, their tones merging into one haunting, echoing chant that filled the room. It was the same voice they'd heard from Tom, twisted and distorted, now layered with other voices, a cacophony of souls trapped within the cabin's grasp. Emma and Sarah backed away from the door, clutching each other as the walls seemed to close in around them, the cabin's dark energy reaching for them, drawing them deeper into its nightmare. Part 9, The Cabin's Grip. They stumbled backward, nearly tripping over each other in their terror, as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Emma's mind raced, trying to remember anything from the journal that might help them escape the cabin's grip. She had a fleeting thought of the family's last words. The children were trapped, bound to the cabin, their spirits unable to leave. What if we're next?" she stammered, voice barely audible over the oppressive noise. Sarah clutched Emma's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "No, we can't, we have to fight this. There has to be a way out." The whispers seemed to respond, their intensity rising as the cabin seemed to mock their desperation. The lights flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls, twisting and contorting in unnatural shapes. Emma's gaze was drawn to the shadows, and she realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't just random patterns. The shadows were forming faces, twisted and anguished, their mouths open in silent screams. The room felt colder now, an unbearable chill that seeped into their bones. They huddled together, their breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. It felt as though the air itself were thickening, pressing down on them with a weight that was almost tangible. "Please," Sarah whimpered, looking around as if hoping for some sign of escape. "Please, let us go." The shadows flickered, and for a brief, horrifying moment, Emma thought she saw the face of the father from the photograph, his hollow eyes staring back at her from the wall, his mouth moving soundlessly, mouthing words she couldn't quite understand. In a surge of terror, Emma turned her flashlight back to the note on the table. But this time, there was something different. The note had changed. Beneath the words, "You'll never leave," were additional lines, scrawled hastily, the ink smeared and dripping. "They took my children. They took my wife. And now they'll take you too." Emma's heart pounded as the words sank in. The cabin hadn't just trapped them, it was claiming them, one by one, feeding on their fear, binding them to its cursed walls just as it had done to the family before them. Part 10, A Desperate Escape. In a moment of clarity, Emma remembered something she'd read in the journal, a fragment about an offering. The father had mentioned it, though his words had been vague, fragmented. It was as if he'd discovered something important but hadn't had the time to write it all down. "What if," she whispered, her mind racing. "What if there's a way to satisfy the cabin? An offering of some kind? Maybe that's how we can escape." Sarah looked at her, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Do you think it'll work?" Emma nodded, though her certainty was wavering. "I don't know, but we have to try. There has to be something the cabin wants, something we can give to break its hold." They glanced around the room, their eyes falling on the strange artifacts scattered throughout the cabin, the blood-stained dress, the symbols scratched into the floor, the bones in the basement. Each item seemed to hold a piece of the cabin's dark history, a token from those it had claimed before. Desperate, they gathered the objects one by one, piling them in the center of the room. They didn't know if this would work, but it was the only plan they had. "Please," Emma whispered as she knelt beside the pile, her voice thick with fear and exhaustion. "Take this, and let us go." For a long moment, nothing happened. The whispers grew silent, and the room was still, the air heavy with anticipation. And then, slowly, the room began to shift. The shadows recoiled, fading back into the walls, and the air grew warmer, lighter. It was as if the cabin itself were drawing back, relinquishing its hold. Emma and Sarah exchanged a hopeful glance, daring to believe that their offering had worked. They reached for the door, their hands trembling, and found that it opened easily now, the heavy weight gone. Without a second thought, they bolted from the cabin, not daring to look back, the whispers fading as they ran into the woods. Behind them, the cabin loomed in the darkness, its windows watching them, the voices murmuring one last, faint echo as they disappeared into the night. More lives. The cabin was silent once more, waiting patiently, biding its time. Emma and Sarah might have escaped, but the cabin would not rest for long. It was always waiting, always hungry, and soon enough, it would draw in new souls, new lives to claim. And in the depths of the forest, Emma and Sarah could still feel its gaze, an unbreakable bond that whispered to them in their dreams, reminding them that they had left a part of themselves behind. They had survived, but they would never truly escape. Story 4. The Forest's Trap. Emma and Sarah burst through the cabin door, finally escaping its oppressive walls, only to stop dead in their tracks. They looked around, confusion quickly morphing into dread. The trail they had followed to get to the cabin, the narrow dirt path winding through the trees, was gone. In its place, an endless stretch of twisted, dark trees loomed around them, their branches gnarled and tangled like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. "This isn't possible," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The path was right here. It should have been morning, the sun still rising over the trees. But the light was rapidly fading, as if dusk had suddenly fallen over the forest. Long shadows stretched across the ground, swallowing the spaces between trees, casting everything in a deep, inky darkness. The faint remnants of sunlight seemed to drain from the sky, leaving them in an unsettling twilight that was thick with shadows. "Emma, what's happening?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with fear as she clutched Emma's arm, her fingers digging in painfully. Emma shook her head, her mind reeling. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was surrounded by something unnatural, something far darker than she could have imagined. The forest had transformed into a twisted nightmare, the trees seeming to grow taller and closer together, as though they were shifting to prevent any escape. The shadows between them deepened, forming dark, impenetrable pockets that hinted at things hidden within. "We have to keep moving," Emma said, her voice a mixture of fear and determination. "There has to be a way out. We just need to find it." They took a few tentative steps, clutching each other tightly as they moved forward. But with every step, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees looming closer, the shadows stretching farther. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the thick, unnerving silence of the woods, as if the forest itself were watching, waiting. A distorted reality. As they walked, Emma noticed something unsettling. The forest was eerily still. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of animals. The only sound was their own shallow breathing and the crackling of dead leaves beneath their feet. "Emma, look!" Sarah's voice was tight with panic, and she pointed ahead. At first, Emma didn't see it. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she spotted what Sarah was pointing at, a shadowy figure in the distance, half hidden behind a tree. It was barely more than a silhouette, its outline blurred and indistinct, but she could make out the form of a person. The figure was standing perfectly still, facing them. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the figure was familiar. The shape, the stance, it looked like Tom. But something was wrong. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and his face was hidden in shadow, making it impossible to see his features. "Tom?" Emma called out, her voice shaky. She took a step forward, pulling Sarah along. But as soon as she moved, the figure vanished, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. "No, no, that can't be," Sarah whispered, her grip on Emma's arm tightening. "We just left the cabin. How could he be here?" Emma didn't have an answer. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. Was the cabin twisting their perceptions? Or had they truly seen Tom, wandering lost in this nightmare forest? "We have to keep moving," she whispered, forcing herself to stay calm. "We have to find a way out of here." But as they moved deeper into the forest, it felt as if they were walking in circles. The trees all looked the same, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. Every now and then, Emma thought she saw a shadow flicker at the edge of her vision, a brief glimpse of a figure standing among the trees, watching them with hollow eyes. An endless labyrinth. The further they walked, the more the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, each turn revealing nothing but more trees and more shadows. It was as if they had stepped into another realm, a place where time and reality bent to the will of the cabin. Emma's legs were beginning to ache, and her breath was ragged, but she forced herself to keep going. Just when she was beginning to lose hope, she saw something glinting among the trees. She squinted, moving closer to get a better look. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the object, a rusted metal sign nailed to a tree, partially obscured by vines. She reached out to clear away the vines, revealing the faded words underneath, "Property of Whitewood Lodge." Beneath the sign, scratched into the wood, was a single word, "Run." Emma's pulse quickened as she stared at the word, its meaning clear and chilling. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn and run, as if the forest itself were warning her. But running felt pointless in this twisted maze, where every direction seemed to lead nowhere. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Emma, I don't think we're going to get out." "No," Emma said firmly, though her own fear was nearly suffocating. "We're going to make it. We just have to keep moving, no matter what we see." But as they turned to continue, a dark shape appeared in front of them, blocking their path. It was the figure again, the same silhouette they had seen before, now closer, its form even more distorted, as if it were part of the shadows themselves. The figure tilted its head, and for a moment, Emma thought she could see its face, pale, hollow, with dark, empty eyes that seemed to bore into her. It took a step toward them, its movement slow, deliberate, as if savoring their terror. Emma and Sarah stumbled back, their instincts screaming at them to run. They turned and fled in the opposite direction, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast they ran, the figure seemed to be right behind them, moving through the shadows with unnatural speed. The trees twisted around them, forming a labyrinthine path that kept leading them back to where they had started. It was as if the forest itself were conspiring against them, forcing them to run in circles, trapping them in a nightmare with no way out. Finally, exhausted and desperate, they stumbled into a small clearing. For a brief, hopeful moment, Emma thought they had found a way out. But as she looked around, her heart sank. In the center of the clearing stood the cabin, dark and ominous, its windows staring back at them like empty, soulless eyes. "No, we just left," Emma whispered, her voice filled with despair. "How are we back here?" They stared at the cabin, its dark outline looming in the dying light. The forest had betrayed them, leading them back to the very place they had tried to escape. The cabin stood silent, waiting, its presence more sinister than ever, as if it had been expecting them all along. As they backed away from the clearing, a low, guttural whisper rose from the cabin, drifting through the air like a dark, ominous wind. The words were faint, barely audible, but they carried a chilling certainty. "You belong to me now." Emma felt a wave of dread wash over her as the realization sank in. They were no longer just visitors to the cabin, they were prisoners. The cabin and the forest were one, an endless, twisted realm that had claimed them. And in this place, time had no meaning. They could try to run, to escape, but the cabin would always be waiting, its doors open, inviting them back into its shadows. Trapped, they stood in the clearing, surrounded by the dark trees and the endless stretch of shadows. In that moment, Emma knew they might never see the outside world again. The forest had changed, warped by the same malevolent force that bound the cabin. And now, it held them in its grip, waiting patiently as they surrendered to its darkness. Story 5. Bound to the Shadows. As the last remnants of light faded, Emma and Sarah's hope dwindled with it. They stood in the clearing, paralyzed by the encroaching darkness that seemed to press in from every side. The air grew colder, carrying a deathly silence that weighed heavily, making it hard to breathe. And then, from the shadows of the trees, Emma saw him, Tom. He stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, his face partially hidden in darkness. She felt a twisted, impossible relief, but it was quickly replaced by terror as she realized something was horribly wrong. Tom's eyes were black, empty voids, absorbing the surrounding darkness rather than reflecting it. His gaze was cold and unfeeling, a far cry from the lively friend they knew. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as his mouth moved, forming words that seemed to echo across the clearing without him truly speaking. "Stay with us," he whispered, his voice carrying an unnatural, distorted tone that reverberated through the stillness. Behind him, other figures began to emerge from the trees, materializing like shadows taking form. Emma recognized the woman from the basement, her hollow eyes locked onto them, her lips twisted into a wide, unnatural smile. And beside her were the two children from the photograph, their faces devoid of life, their small hands clutching each other as they stood in eerie silence. More figures gathered around them, men and women, children, all bearing the same empty eyes, their faces marked by years of anguish and despair. Their bodies seemed to flicker, wavering between shadow and substance, as if caught between worlds. Emma realized with growing dread that these were the spirits of those who had come to the cabin before, trapped in its cursed grasp, forever bound to its dark will. Sarah whimpered, taking a step back, her voice barely a whisper. "Emma, we're surrounded." Emma gripped her friend's hand tightly, her own terror rising as the ghostly figures advanced, their expressions vacant, devoid of anything human. The clearing was filled with their murmurs, a chorus of voices, hollow and broken, chanting the same words over and over. "Stay with us, stay with us." The words seemed to seep into their minds, filling them with a strange, otherworldly compulsion, an urge to give in, to surrender. Emma fought against it, struggling to hold on to her last shred of will. But the more she resisted, the stronger the pull became, as if the cabin itself were reaching out to claim them. Tom took another step forward, his gaze fixed on Emma. She could see his face more clearly now, and the sight made her stomach churn. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, his features twisted and hollow. There was no trace of the friend she had known, only a shell, a puppet controlled by the malevolent force of the cabin. "Join us," he whispered, his voice low and pleading. "We can be together, forever." Emma's heart raced as she looked into his empty eyes, the horror of his words settling over her. The figures closed in around them, their shadows blending into the darkness, creating an unbreakable circle. She and Sarah were trapped, bound to this place just as the others had been. Emma clenched her fists, a fierce determination surging through her. She wouldn't, become like them. She wouldn't let the cabin take her, not without a fight. "Run," she whispered to Sarah, her voice barely audible. "We have to break through, somehow." But before they could move, the woman from the basement stepped forward, her smile widening, her eyes fixed on Emma with a chilling intensity. She reached out a hand, pale and translucent, her fingers beckoning them closer. Emma felt a coldness wash over her, as if the woman's gaze alone could freeze her in place. "You belong here now," the woman whispered, her voice soft yet filled with an ancient malice. "The cabin chose you. It's been waiting for you, both of you." Emma and Sarah clung to each other, their minds racing, but there was nowhere to go. The spirits surrounded them, their vacant eyes watching, their shadows stretching across the ground, binding them in place. And then, Emma heard it, the low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the earth itself, the same voice she had heard in the cabin. It was the voice of the cabin, the ancient, malevolent force that had claimed the souls of all who had come before. "You are mine." The words filled the air, reverberating through the clearing, and Emma felt the last of her strength slipping away. She and Sarah were drawn forward, compelled by a force stronger than their own will. The spirits parted, forming a path that led back to the cabin, its dark outline looming like a specter against the night sky. The doorway seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if inviting them in, welcoming them back into its eternal grasp. Emma knew that if they stepped through that door, they would be lost forever, bound to the cabin just like the others. But as she looked at Sarah, a fierce determination filled her. She wouldn't let this place take them. She wouldn't let the cabin win. With the last of her strength, Emma tore herself away from the pull of the spirits and grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her back, away from the cabin's doorway. She closed her eyes, blocking out the ghostly faces, the empty eyes, and the whispers that called to her. In that moment, she focused all her energy on one thought: escape. A final stand. With a sudden surge of defiance, Emma turned and sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, dragging Sarah along with her. She could feel the spirits closing in, their cold hands reaching out, their whispers rising in a desperate, angry chant. But she didn't stop. She didn't look back. They plunged into the dark forest, the shadows closing in around them, the twisted trees seeming to shift and move, blocking their path. But Emma pushed forward, her mind focused on one thing: getting as far from the cabin as possible. The whispers faded, the shadows receded, and the forest began to open up, the trees thinning as they ran. Emma dared to hope that they were escaping, that they had broken free from the cabin's curse. But as they emerged into the clearing, their hearts sank. There, standing in the center, was the cabin, dark and foreboding, its windows watching them like empty eyes. They had never truly left, the forest had only led them in circles, bringing them back to the beginning. Exhausted and defeated, they fell to their knees, the weight of their despair crushing them. They were trapped, bound to this place, just as the spirits before them had been. As the night deepened, the spirits surrounded them once more, their hollow eyes filled with a dark, unending hunger. Emma and Sarah knew, in their hearts, that there was no escape. The cabin had chosen them, and now, they were its prisoners. In the depths of the forest, the whispers continued, mingling with the cold night air, as the cabin stood silent, waiting for its next visitors, its hunger never satisfied. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.